In this video, I'm going to take a look at a handful of problems from Chapter 1, Section 2, Exercise 1. In this particular exercise, you are to determine, first of all, whether or not a given passage is either an argument or a non-argument. If it's not a non-argument, if it's not an argument, that is, you're asked to identify the particular type of non-argument. And just as a heads up, be sure to check out the study guide. Problems of this nature are heavily featured on Test 1, determining if a passage is an argument or a non-argument. And this sounds as though it's pretty straightforward, but some of these can actually be fairly tricky. So it's quite important that even though it's not collected for homework, Chapter 1, Section 2, Exercise 1, it's not collected for homework. It is crucial that you practice in preparation for each of the tests, not just, of course, test number 1. So let's take a look at, again, a handful of examples. Example number 1. The turkey vulture is called by that name because its red featherless head resembles the head of a wild turkey. So first of all, let's determine, is this an argument? Is it a non-argument? And perhaps a quick little recap would be beneficial. What actually constitutes an argument? An argument, remember, consists of two things. We need two components to have ourselves an argument. For an argument, and I'll just quickly sketch this in here at the top, we need at least one premise. A premise is a special type of statement, a sentence that's either true or false. And the role of a premise is to offer up supporting reasons, to offer up, that is, evidence. So if we're going to have an argument, we need at least one premise. We could have multiple premises. And further, we need a conclusion. We need to claim that something follows from the premises. We need to claim that something, that is, follows from the provided evidence. We might very well have one, but not the other. And if that's the case, we don't have an argument. For an argument, we need both. So we want to know, first of all, is this first example actually an argument? And it might be easy enough to think that it is an argument, because notice here from Chapter 1, Section 1, it does contain a premise indicator. Because is a premise indicator indicating that a reason is to follow. And so given that it contains a premise indicator, you might think that this one is an argument. But this first example is actually from Chapter 1, Section 2, Chapter 1, Section 2. This one's actually an explanation. So let's start there. And this is featured in the text straight out of the assigned reading here. But again, it's key that you practice. An explanation is an expression that purports to shed light on some event or phenomenon. So there's the formal definition from Chapter 1, Section 2. An explanation consists of two parts, and you'll need to get each of these parts down. Here's the fancy vocab explanation. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But again, an explanation consists of two parts. Explanandum, there's the fancy lingo, and the explanans. I'll have you look up the definition of each. The explanandum, that's an accepted fact. I guess I'll be nice here and go ahead and write it out. Accepted fact. So in this case, let's go ahead and identify the explanandum. The accepted fact is the name here of this particular bird. It's called a turkey vulture. The explanans, this is claiming to shed light on that accepted fact. So if our accepted fact, the explanandum, is that this bird is called a turkey vulture, the explanans is shedding light on that fact. It's explaining to us why. It's explanation. It's explaining to us why it has that name, turkey vulture. And there's the explanans shedding light on that name because it has a red featherless head that resembles a wild turkey. So again, it's easy enough to think that this is an argument. After all, it's got a premise indicator, must be an argument, but this one's actually an explanation. It's an expression that purports to shed light on some event or phenomenon. It's explaining, in this case, why the turkey vulture has that name. And again, there's the fancy lingo. Make sure you get those straight for test number 1 as well. So let's take a look at another example. We'll go through a handful in a single video. If public education fails to improve the quality of instruction in both primary and secondary schools, then it's likely that it will lose additional students to the private sector in years ahead. So we want to know, is this an argument? Is this a non-argument? And again, it might look as though on the surface that this one is actually an argument, but remember, let me slide back up here to the top. For it to be an argument, we actually need 2 parts. We have to have at least one premise, maybe multiple premises, and then we need a conclusion, a claim that something follows from that evidence. So take a good look at problem number 2, or example number 2, and notice that it's just a single statement. How could a single statement have both a premise and a conclusion? So this one's not an argument. This one actually is what's called a conditional statement. Remember, if it's a non-argument, we need to identify the type. A conditional statement, there's the fancy lingo, it'll be featured on the test. A conditional statement is just simply an if-then statement. An if-then statement. That's all it's meant by a conditional statement. An if-then statement. And given the definition, it's pretty obvious now that our example is in fact a conditional statement. If this, then that. If A, then B. Here's a little bit more detail, and you'll need to get this down too, practice. A conditional statement consists of 2 parts. It's got an antecedent and a consequent. And this is real easy. The antecedent is that which immediately follows the if. If, so let me underline this entire thing, that which immediately follows the if, that's our antecedent. That's the antecedent. I'll just abbreviate there. The consequent, conditional statement's got 2 parts. The consequent is that which immediately follows the then. So this is a lengthy consequent, but there is the consequent. And again, I'll just abbreviate here. So the single statement isn't an argument. It's just a conditional statement. It's got an antecedent. It's got a consequent. Now we could build on the single statement and turn it into an argument, but we're not quite there yet. So let's take a look at a passage that actually is an argument. And I know here I'm spilling the beans before we even get to it. But let's take a look at the 3rd example for this video. Freedom of the press is the most important of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. Without it, our other freedoms would be immediately threatened. Furthermore, it provides the fulcrum for the advancement of new freedoms. So now we've got an argument. It's a short argument, but we've got each of our 2 parts. We've got premises, we've got a conclusion. And this is a skill developed in an earlier exercise, something that you should continue to practice on, picking out, if you know it's an argument, the individual premises as well as the conclusion. So what's the conclusion here? And the conclusion actually turns out to be the first sentence. Freedom of the press is the most important of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. So there's the conclusion, sentence 1. What evidence is given, what reasons are given to back up that conclusion? And we actually have 2 premises here. Without it, our other freedoms would be immediately threatened. So there's P1. There's the first reason to support the claim that freedom of the press is the most important of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. So there's P1, and P2 here is the last sentence, of course. Premise 2, furthermore, it provides the fulcrum for the advancement of new freedoms. So if we're going to lay this out formally, we'd have P1, premise 1, and I won't write out that entire second sentence, but that's our opening premise. P2, again, is our last sentence. Furthermore, it provides so on and so forth. And then the conclusion, therefore, freedom of the press is the most important of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. So now we've got ourselves an argument, a formal argument. And this will be the last example that I'll cover for this particular video. The 4th example. A mammal is a vertebrate animal. A mammal is a vertebrate animal that nurses its offspring. Thus, cats and dogs are mammals, as are sheep, monkeys, rabbits, and bears. So this is kind of a tricky one here. It's got multiple sentences. Notice that this one's got a conclusion indicator. Thus. So it's easy enough to take a look at this and think, aha, thus, conclusion indicator. That last sentence is our conclusion. And, well, for an argument, we also need a premise. So what's the premise? Well, P1, the only premise must be sentence 1. A mammal is a vertebrate animal that nurses its offspring. So surface level analysis would lead us to conclude here that this is an argument. It's got a single premise, and it's got a conclusion indicator. So there is the conclusion. But this one is actually an illustration. A little trickier than meets the eye. Again, practice is key in preparing for the test. Otherwise, the test is not going to go so smoothly. An illustration, let's start there. An illustration is an expression involving one or more examples that is intended to show what something means or how it's done. I'm not going to write that whole thing out. That's straight out of the text, chapter 1, section 2. An illustration is an expression involving one or more examples that's intended to show what something means or how it is done. So this first sentence gives us a definition. A mammal is a vertebrate that nurses its offspring. And notice then that the second sentence, even though there's a conclusion indicator in there, is giving us examples of various mammals, intending to show us what is meant by a mammal. A mammal is a vertebrate, nurses its offspring, and several examples of mammals are given. Cats, dogs, sheep, monkeys, rabbits, bears. So it's easy to look at this and think, again, it's an argument, it's got a conclusion indicator, but this one's actually an illustration. So continue to practice. This again is chapter 1, section 2, and these examples are all from exercise 1. These types of problems are going to be heavily featured on the test. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. But what you need to do is practice, check your answers. If you're consistently making mistakes, then don't hesitate to give me a call, send me an email. We can use the chat tab, and let's correct any mistakes that you're making in the practice exercises before you take the test for actual points that are going to determine your grade.